Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Curiosus Animus. I'm Scott, and today I have a fantastic guest here, Ranger Nick, uh, Pizza Pickle Spur on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken.
That's it.
And this gentleman has razzle dazzled me a number of times in different Twitter spaces with fascinating information in the health field. And also, I've come to understand he's uh, well versed, far more than I, in Rife technology or spooky technology. So I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, sir.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to join you, and hello to everybody that's catching us in this conversation on a Friday evening. Yeah, I'm a multidisciplinary investigator, and that's a way of saying I started into an academic track, to go up into the ivory tower, and the psychology and the politics of it were a reality that I just wasn't willing to compromise. So I backed out and went into, private industry, but I've always maintained a broad set of areas that I'm fascinated with. And some things are by historical edification, some things are by design, some things are by necessity, like things that are affecting my health will push me into material that I wasn't familiar with. And you sort of fall through the cavern into, these worlds of information and insight and perspective that you don't get during that 7-minute encounter with your primary care physician. So that was the big change for me as going from someone who didn't really have a deep laboratory or analytic scientific background to someone who now can traverse it. I can understand it. And more importantly, I find myself really excited about the things that have been hidden, the things that have been covered up. And of course, that just sparks the question, why? How come? What was in there that people couldn't have it? Because, the crazy guy that walks down the street with a sandwich board sign that the end is near, people don't take him down with a taser. They don't send the cops after him to tackle them. If you're genuinely, not of this world, you're allowed pretty much to wander around as long as you don't hurt yourself. But when really, really amazing credentialed scientists have their work obfuscated and then pursued and subsumed, like Nikola Tesla as another example, that really draws my attention.
It's funny you mentioned that. I had heard a story that uh, John Greenwald of the Black Vault had submitted two different FOIA requests. One had the characteristics of a crazy person, well, an unorthodox person with run-on sentences, bad spelling, no punctuation, that kind of thing, and it got exactly the information he was looking for. While the one that was uh, classically written got nothing back; it was denied. So I find that pretty neat that you bring that up. It's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, and I feel for people who in their course of investigative work are really sort of blocked or dependent upon getting through the FOIA pathway. I haven't ever taken that. I've only ever taken advantage of the work of previous investigators. And when it comes to talking about royal rife and electromagnetism being applied to the body in a very simple technique to do two different treatment modalities. One of them being to attack infectious pathogens, and the other being to trigger the body to release or excite and put into the exit pathways toxins that are built up in the body. That was the basis of Rife's investigation and many others around him who followed on with his work, like Dr. Hulda Clark, who continued doing microscopies and real bench in, gathering data, doing actual experiments, applying the techniques to a variety of viruses and bacteria. And it proved to be quite illuminating that there was an effective treatment there. So that was one of those things that I like, we were saying about hidden history. the things that Tesla began to explore about health and vibration. I'm actually that's a pocket where I'm not as familiar. I'd like to know. I mean, Tesla had to have affected Rife. They had to have known of each other, or in some respect. And Rife was an engineer too. Prior to getting into the energetic stuff, he engineered a new type of microscope. So this is he was a hardcore scientist of the day, and it's very interesting, sort of what happened.
It is. With the two different modalities of that, could you expound on the second one first, if you don't mind, that you had mentioned?
Sure. Was that toxic burden versus infectious burden?
I believe you had mentioned causing the expression of toxins that had been built up.
Yes, yes, yes. Toxic burden. So these are the tenets. That's the great thing about going back and looking at these scientists' work. There was no secret decoder ring. There was no big volume of their special tomes that you had to buy in order to figure it all out. They were very, very practical and straightforward with those two tenets. And the tenet that we'll go into first is about the buildup of toxins in the body. So you have a variety. We have a great deal of minerals. We're composed of a lot of minerals, and the number of minerals that right now we have challenges with, the deficits are one of those strange situations of imbalance. So I'm going to go down a little side passage here to talk about vitamin D. Your vitamin D. Everybody knows their vitamin D. We have an app for their vitamin D. It's 4 o'clock. Did you check your vitamin D levels? Everyone is for years now has been very into how much do you take? Well, I take 10,000. Would you take 5,000? Um, and the root of that is because there's been a problem in the food supply, and that is the glyphosate, which is a chemical chelator, and it atomically binds to our magnesium. And in order for your vitamin D to be brought up, to go up through the uptake pathway, you have to have magnesium to bind to it. So the glyphosate goes through and it's like a Swiffer, and it just grabs your good minerals and they pass right through your body. And you can be taking handfuls of vitamin D. You can be drinking liquid vitamin D and spending all kinds of money on special, all that stuff. And it'll go right through you if you don't clean up your diet. So that's one of the things about the toxins. Why I go there is because glyphosate is a key toxin. And there are approaches to removing toxins out of the body. So before I go into anything about what Rife and Clark and the others postulated and demonstrated in many cases, I want to say that this technology is not a silver bullet. There's nothing about it that's going to solve, the world's energy problem, or save the whales, or get rid of grandma's cancer. It is a anomaly, and quite frankly, considering that it was suppressed, and we can talk a little bit more about that, sort of the history of what happened to Rife's intellectual property. Um, Even though it got stepped on, nowadays, suddenly there's energy therapies and electromagnetic therapies and sonic bed therapies. There's a whole little variety of technologies that are suddenly quite fine and approved by, the FDA and the AMA and all of that. And then there are some that are that didn't go through the mainstream channels, and they are available through European markets and Asian markets. Or you have to go to Mexico to get those treatments. But coming back to toxins, what we're going to talk about here is generally a very simple principle. You don't need a pencil and paper. I'm not going to be, sending links about this detail. It's about
Ooh, did we lose you here, Nick? And go. Well, we're back after some technical difficulties on my end. So, Nick, you were just about to start to talk about resonance.
absolutely. There were some really, I went into a side discussion about glyphosate as an example of one of those key toxins that can build up in the body. Now, some toxins are quick, some toxins are difficult. And some toxins, when they come out of their dormant state in whatever wherever they're at in the body, in the reservoir, you need to think about what's going to happen to them. So, a word of caution as we're starting to discuss something that really falls under sort of a therapeutic band called chelation. This show is not intended to treat, cure, or prescribe. And we're talking about therapies in a historical context. And right now, we're talking about the concepts of toxins in the cells in the bodies. So, thinking about resonance, and when you think of the classic example of a wine glass that you get to shatter because of a sonic resonance, it's not that dramatic, but you're trying to get the cells to react and respond. You're trying to trigger awareness of those mechanisms that will then do an exit path out of the cell. And that's where you have to be thinking about what's going to happen. With if you excrete a bunch of mercury that's in cellular reservoirs in the body, and it suddenly becomes bioavailable mercury again, it doesn't just because it moved out of one apartment doesn't mean it won't move right back into another. That's the point. So therein lies the uh, precautionary tale about having a strategy if you're approaching clearing things out of the body, and that the frequency technologies can be a very nice, gentle, low grade, or what's called a tonic therapy. So, very much like people drink lemon water. Well, there's a couple significant benefits from putting a fresh organic lemon slice in your water. And we won't go into all of that, but I'm saying that is a tonic therapy. You're not going to reverse tumors with lemon water. With the Rife device, when it comes to keeping the garbage, particularly, you're thinking about the heavy metals and the pesticides. And I'm sorry, but I haven't explored, and I don't know if there's additional benefits like microplastics. That's probably a very, very important, particularly if those are in affecting us in the endocrine system and shifting or remodulating hormonal expression. There's all kinds of reasons to fix that, you know, from mood to all sorts of more acute or pronounced expression of dysregulating the systems. So that's part of what I'm trying to get at with this therapy being one of many in a good arsenal that includes all of the right things that we all know, the ABCs about sleep. There are things that your brain does while you sleep that it doesn't do while we're awake. It actually compresses down like a sponge and gets much smaller. And all of your spinal column fluid cycles in and around the cerebellum. You didn't know this. You've had a
No,
brain inside your head all these years, and you didn't know that every night it goes through a little compression cycle. Yep,
I
yep, yep.
had absolutely no idea, but it stands to reason with everything else I've learned about compression and release or tension and release being a big part of everyday life, whether people think about it or not. Everything from uh, an orgasm to music. Music is pleasant because there are moments of tension and moments of release. We go through cycles of life in the same very manner. It's hyper prevalent through existence, in my opinion.
Well, that brain cycle fascinated me. I didn't learn about that until just a few years ago, and I really wasn't too versed at all in anything about neuropathology, which is where I will say that's probably where I will draw the line in my expertise as far as making comments about things tonight. I am not a biologist, and I'm not a neurophysiologist or a neurologist. But what I do think I have a decent understanding of is the domain of the infectious burden that we can encounter through a number of different vectors, and how that can affect the long-term health of the brain, both in a physical form and in a neuropsychiatric form. So certain infections, and I'm not talking just about a virus. We're talking about now, like say a prion, uh, is a seed. You know, there is no safe amount. There's no like, oh yeah, I can get 16,000 cells of that and I'll be fine. You shouldn't get that stuff. Period. And we exchange it. Unfortunately, I don't think it's understood that it's in the sexually transmitted domain. So people don't know that things like prionic disorders and autoimmune disorders, and unfortunately, if you don't know, cancer, many types of cancer have an infectious component, and some other, some other situations are definitely topics that get missed when you have sex ed. You don't talk about progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy being the outcome, a long-term, very, very difficult, acute neurologic outcome of the JC virus. There's all of those relationships. So now we've already kind of slid over into infectious burden. We went from toxic burden to infectious burden. Let me just stop there before we go any further into the bugs and see what you think.
I'm really enamored, and it's very interesting. So it when it comes to resonance as medicine, I think that a lot of people automatically categorize that as hullabaloo and don't associate it with using ultrasonic to break apart kidney stones inside of people so that they're easier to pass, or ultrasounds where you're looking at the fetus inside of the womb. So,
Mm-hmm.
sound in medicine is not something that is extraordinary. Like that, and electric medicine also, but that's kind of another topic entirely. So that's
Well, no, 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 no. I'd say electric medicine is kind of a good gateway drug for getting people into the topic of rife, because if they've had physical therapy, they had a back injury, they had a surgery, and they had to repair some portion of their body, and they decided to opt for one of those contraction devices. I can't even think of what they're called off the top of my
TENS
head.
unit.
Okay, yep. I know TENS pad, but so they're called a TENS unit, and it works. It just makes the body work automatically. You can think of yourself like a frog in the lab on the plate and zapping it to make it twitch. It flexes the muscles, and it does it quite scientifically and quite effectively. But that's a very, very pronounced and specific application of a current across the body cavity. And these microbiology techniques, this rife magic, this spooky stuff, is extremely, extremely subtle, and the waveforms are at very, very different points on the electromagnetic spectrum, and the modulation of the waveforms can be very, very specific. That as described by the investigators when you look at the Spooky 2 materials, because you can go out and get their software for free. You don't have to have the device. There's an operating system that you use when you buy that little device. Let's stop right there. Do you have one of these now, or are you just investigating?
I'm currently investigating, and
Yeah.
to be clear to anybody listening, I do not make any kind of money from this. I'm not name dropping them for a reason. It's just the foremost piece of equipment that I've been able to come across. That's all.
Yeah, and I have no conflicts of interest with any products or devices or any of these things. I'm just an investigator who is happy to share, and I have a number of colleagues who, from a very, very skeptical neuroscientist to a very, very expansive and I'll say cross-disciplinary emergency doctor friend. And everybody in between. So I don't talk about rife with everyone, but for folks that are interested in it, we're talking about, yeah, a brand that has emerged as a leader for a couple of reasons. It's accessible. It's not $20,000. There's a large community of people around the world who have discovered it and continue to apply it to a variety of situations with health, cognition, including pets like fleas, helping deal with fleas. And we were talking about resonance and, excreting toxins from the body. And before I go into the mechanics of how this technology works, because it has different modes, it isn't all the same thing. I'm trying to think of a multimodal tool, like when you've got an adaptive screwdriver that you can pull out the magnetic bit, and you got the Phillips head, you got the standard head, etc. Um, it's very similar to that, in a crude analogy. But coming back to, let's talk about bugs a little bit more before we get into this therapy that we're interested in.
Bugs
There
as parasites or bugs
bugs
as
is,
like
I'm going to say,
exosomes?
I'm not, yeah, right. So tonight I'm just going to assume that there might be somebody out there that doesn't know what an exosome is versus a RNA versus a DNA virus of different classifications and morphologies. There are different scales. Um, versus a pleomorphic organism in a number of categorizations. There are bacteria that are pleomorphic. There are viruses that are pleomorphic. There's so many slicing and dicing, and I think right now there's a bit of a renaissance argument going on with some of the biologists and virologists about what is a germ. I don't think it's germ denialism, but I'm going to say tonight, I'm just going to say pathogen. I'll say pathogen. I know some specific names. And I already dropped, a couple of them, but this isn't about rolling off all of that Latin and particularly things that might go past people. I want this to be a discussion that's practical and approachable. So, I'll say the pathogens that we pick up come from a couple of different key areas. One of them we've already touched on, and that's sexual contact. So another is pets. And as we understand, at least, as I look around my part of the world, people have pets of all kinds, and they have exposures to animals of all kinds of, not just walking through the pet store, but at people's homes, at schools, in their activities and lives and whatever. Not just the 4-H kids. We're talking all the little exotic creepy crawlies that we get from everywhere that end up in someone's home. So there's an unknown spectrum of infectious burden, and there really aren't practical tools for us as that are affordable, that are dependable, and that are comprehensive right now, that I would say, yeah, go out and get this battery of tests, and it's gonna screen you for everything. I've had this fascination about the Star Trek tricorder since I was a little kid, and I just assumed at some point there's going to be a magic little box that will tell you precisely what's wrong. And we've made leaps and bounds. I mean, the MRI is not exactly the tricorder, but we've made some fantastic advances in medical science. But the point being is that we approach these therapies with coming back to those two basic, very simple precepts. We will accumulate a toxic burden because generally of what we eat and breathe. We will accumulate an infectious burden because of the other living beings that we interact with. That's it. That's as complex as their model was. And they went into, I think, more of the infectious side than the followers that came on in the more recent years who have done work on showing how levels of metals, pesticides, etc. They've done a baseline test, and then they do a battery of Rife treatments, and then they do another test, and they demonstrate that there's a drop in the baseline of clearing certain things out, like aluminum, mercury, strontium, things that are specifically toxic and have a very distinct, when you do whatever you're doing, if you're doing mass spectrometry or however you're quantifying, you can get a good, clear read. It's not like arguing over the genome of something. So that's just sort of putting a lid on that Tupperware of all of the pathogens we get exposed to. Dogs, cats, especially, can also transmit toxoplasmosis. So I want to just make a cautionary tale here about anybody whose loved ones are affected by pronounced or prolonged depression. Toxoplasmosis has an influence in your psychiatry or your neuropsychiatry of an imbalance, a bias that it creates. It's part of its mechanism to propagate itself in the flea rat predator cycle. It has this cool little dance it does. I've seen some amazing speeches on toxo. It's a whole PhD, but that's one of those things that is one of the sort of subtle. You don't know that you've had a toxo exposure. You might not know about it. And then suddenly life changes, and you might be doing the same things, eating the same food, having the same good habits or routines, whatever, but something has shifted. And it might be a biological basis. A couple of other bugs, and we're not going to do big catalogs of germs, but a couple of other pathogens that are affecting in the psychiatric domain are HERV type K and type W. So if people are prone to, look something up or just Google something while you're sitting in a meeting or on the bus, look up HERV, type K and type W. And then if you pull in other keywords like psychology, psychiatry, schizophrenia, depression, suicide, you'll find that there is a domain of infectious burden that isn't really emphasized if you've got, particularly, I mean, I guess I'm really talking right now to parents, when you've got a little one who goes through more than just a hormonal shift, a growing pain, a phase, where we see something that becomes a long-term trend. I would caution you to explore the potentials of a biological concern. And why we would even talk about that is that some of these therapies can clear them from the body, whether they're in the brain tissue, whether they're in the glands around the body, whether in the marrow, whatever the cellular reservoir, the tropism for that particular type of infection, there are ways to effectively clear it out. This type of a technology has been demonstrated, and I will emphasize anecdotally by eyewitness testimonies. So that's the other side of that coin of not saying it's been proven or demonstrated or shown. You can't say those things, but it has been reported anecdotally to have some very pronounced and amazing effect on difficult long-term disease states. People who turned to it when there was nothing else left, and others who turned to it and use it quite proactively to stay ahead of the disease states that might emerge because of that infectious burden. So you get where I'm going. If you have a blackberry bush, if you just go every 2-3 weeks and go trim off the tips of that blackberry bush, pretty soon it'll be like a hydra. It'll have 20 heads and it'll sprout in all different directions. That's the kind of encouragement that you give these latent infections over time, some of them, with ineffective pharmacology, or just not treating it at all, not diagnosing and not trying to approach it. But if you go after the root of the problem, then you can sidestep and prevent the need for pharmacology A, and then B, and then when that doesn't work, type C, and then it gets paired up with type D. If we're talking about dealing with certain types of psychiatric conditions, approaches to balancing someone's meds. We all know I'm very sad that that's in our human lexicon where I know he's off his meds. No, there could be a very, very real biological underlying condition there that everyone ignores. And a psychiatrist and a psychologist certainly aren't going to tip over their own apple cart. No, no, no. The psychiatrist is going to go towards the prescription pad.
It's
And
true.
there's going to be a checklist of things that they say, this is the measure. Well, I'm sorry, but those aren't quantitative. And I would say that as a responsible integrative medicine patient, I always look beyond the allopathic standard of care. And I always consider what else, what other models, what other inputs. And I'm not talking about just another white coat down the street or in another wing of the hospital that gives you a second opinion. I'm talking about really exercising and stretching your approach to root cause analysis of problems, trusting the body's natural balance and systems, and not making severe adjustments. Let me just park my mouth there and see what you think of all that.
I agree. I think that people in general tend to become complacent with putting their faith in a system that may not in earnest have their total well-being in their sights, if that makes sense. When it comes to
Yeah, yeah, that
like the American Medical Association and whatnot, I'm aware of some of the history and the the name eludes me at the moment, but the document that essentially put the kibosh on the other fields of medicine that were standing equivocally up to pharmacology and surgical intervention prior to 1900, I want to say. Um, Before then, herbalists, chiropractors, uh, energy workers all kind of had an even keel. And then this document came out that was produced by, well, funded by the Rockefellers. And since then, things have kind of steered in one direction. And I'm guilty of this myself because when my own mother got cancer, she was very much into this stuff at the same time, but she also chose to go see an oncologist and get it handled that route, you know. And I may have been unkind about my opinion on the matter, but as I learn more and look around more, Eastern medicine also has its place. Not always for every situation, but it certainly does take a look at things from a different angle. And as I understand it, even Nikola Tesla, while he was studying engineering in the West, he also had himself a guru from India, and he was learning about things on the spiritual side from the other end. So I think that both spirit and science have a place on the same coin. They may be on opposite ends, but it's the same material for me.
I like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's I'm not I don't like to be an anti-Mormon or anti-Catholic or anti-Jewish or anti-Orthodox, whatever. Um, I really appreciate, and I've traveled a little bit. I'm not, I'm not. I haven't lived overseas, outside of the United States, but I've seen and have connections with cultures around the world at a decent level of insight, and I just think that it's important to constantly look across the aisle with respect. And when, for example, when I know that I've said some made some pointed references tonight about white coats. I have some nurses and doctors and specialists who I love. I just worship them, and they're wonderful, and they're healers, and they're scientists, and they're human beings. They're fallible. They do not owe everybody. Um, being protected from the ravages of the human condition and our biology and the world. They don't owe it to us because they have that degree to fix every problem. So I really appreciate and want to acknowledge what you just said. The further along I get in life, the more, I guess, a little not startled, but just I'm like, interesting that I'm willing to consider that an emotional or a psychological injury could well be at the root of a problem for someone. I just think it's like, well, it's a complex system, and there are, for example, there are, you can, if you need to be empirical, if it's got to be quantifiable in a test tube or under the microscope, you could talk about the dynamic. And I've heard Dr. Andrew Huberman, have some excellent conversations about these aspects of emotion and psychology, and particularly stress related to hormone expression. So you're like, okay, if you need it to be empirical, yeah, feelings equals physical changes, biological changes, and those things have an effect on all kinds of aspects of our health.
Wholeheartedly. Um, if you're in a very uncomfortable place mentally for a long period of time, the chances are that physically you will not be feeling fantastic. You're not going to want to get up and run 2 miles when you don't even want to breathe in the morning. So, absolutely, it's all part of the same system as you just said. Um, and we are electrical chemical beings. And people tend to forget that everything that you're using to process and what you call the real world is an interpretation of this little mass of fat and electricity up here.
It is indeed. Well, so let's talk about let's get into the Rife device.
Mm,
So we've talked about uh, the basic principles. We've gone back and restated them. We've talked about some examples. We've differentiated some specific infectious burden that can relate to psychiatric diagnoses. And also, I think it's fair and important to mention that there is a decent swarm of these little buggers that we can encounter that relate to cancer. So cancer is a complex situation. There isn't a single formula or exact, like, step one, step two, step three. Oncologists, biologists, a great number of specialists can describe all of the processes, the signaling that occurs when a cell starts to grow out of control, the things that might allow that to occur. But generally, what seems to be missed in that conversation are things like the herpes virus family, which most of them are witnesses. Yeah, it's I'm as a multidisciplinary investigator, which is a mouthful, which just means I will swim under the lane line. I'll go over to that lane and then I'll swim under the next lane. I'll go over the next lane. It doesn't mean I'm going to win the Olympics, and I don't come to any of these discussions with I try to really check ego at the door, and it's just about let's talk about history, evidence, probabilities, and let's go ahead and talk about things that have been suppressed or might be difficult. Cancer as an infectious situation is a very difficult aspect of public health that a lot of people don't understand. If you need to sort of wrap your arms or your hands around it, think of the Gardasil product, the injection that was pushed a whole lot, really, really marketed hard years ago. I don't remember. I think it was about 2006 or 2008 that it came out onto the market, and it was to help protect adolescents, originally girls, and then it was flipped to be recommended to everybody under a certain age to protect against encounters with 4 specific strains of HPV, the human papillomavirus. And there are 4, which if you get just one of them or 2, 3, or 4 of them, it's kind of like, like a deck of cards. You get the full house. Your probability of presenting a cancer as a result of that infection goes up and up and up. And there are other cofactors. There are other things. There are other epigenetic factors. There are toxicity factors. There's glyphosate. Glyphosate in the food can play a role in your susceptibility to whether or not you have a good or a weakened defense against cancer, things like that. So that's one area that, as we go into this, it's why it would be good to have a therapy like this, because the device that we're talking about, since we're not streaming, we're not showing, it's not a commercial, and again, this is a no conflict of interest. I just love this product, this tool, and there are others out in the market. And there's certainly a whole lot of investigation and learning that you can do about the topics that we're sharing tonight. But the Rife device has, as I said before, multiple ways. Sort of think of it as the interchangeable screwdriver. It's got multiple screwdriver heads. And there's the tens pads. So think of a classic wire that goes to a sticky pad. If you've been in the hospital and you had the heart meter on, you've had a tens pad. It's got the Hulda Clark tubes. Her little zapper, Dr. Hulda Clark, was one of the followers of Dr. Rife. She was one of the major contributors to the work. And her device, basically, she relied on a single frequency set. She just thought that it was the silver bullet frequency. And it certainly is broadly effective. But her approach would be to have someone hold 2 simple hollow copper tubes, just like 3 or 4 inches of copper tube with an alligator clip on either one, and then the circuit that came out of the machine would go up one arm across the chest and then down the other. So those are two of the very, very basic, what are called contact modes. Then we get into, as we were discussing earlier, like the wine glass trick, making the wine glass shatter because of a particular resonant frequency that matches the physical morphology, the dynamics of that glass, as well as its composition. And it gets into such a vibrational state that it destabilizes it and it shatters. So that's what we're trying to do to these bugs, to these infectious, this burden that we've been discussing by applying these therapies. In particular, now we're talking about a resonant therapy. This is another mode. It's called remote. And this was the one that at first I was really skeptical about. I'm like, this is just a little bit too Disney magic for me, a little too Harry Potter. But let's talk about it. It's a clamshell that makes, basically, think of literally like a small envelope space. It's called a diode circuit. And you put your fingernails, or you can do a blood sample or a saliva sample, but fingernails, toenails are the easiest. And you put them inside of this little diode and close it up. And it applies the resonant frequencies very, very strongly to your DNA. Now, your sample is only good for about 30 days, allegedly. I do not have, advanced quantitative tools, nor have I had the money or the resources to pursue that, to do some baseline tests to say, okay, let's take subject A with a known set of diseases and toxic burden. Let's do a whole battery of tests on them. And then let's do everything we can with the right device and measure them after 30 days. That would be the kind of thing that I'd love to do as an investigator. But these folks that design the frequency sets and contribute to this big open source bank, you'll see many of them are more talkative than me. They are quite well versed, and they tie not only the relationship of the frequency that they are recommending or designing, and quite often it's a group, it's a family, because there's genetic variability within a particular pathogen. So you don't want to just get number 6, you want to get 1 through 12. You want to get them all. So as they build these frequencies and contribute them to John White, John is kind of the hub to all of the spokes. I think he's in South Africa. Uh, they also include a whole lot of great information about the pathogen and its relationship to disease. So it isn't all about cancer. There are pathogens that cause and can be related to a number of other problems in the body with long-term health. So it's very, very interesting. This hasn't been some kind of a product that evokes a faith response or a belief response, or I hope, my fingers crossed. It's quite quantitative. It's quite empirical. But again, it's a tonic treatment. It is not. It doesn't fix things overnight with these low-powered treatments. Now let's talk about the weird miracle stuff.
Can I
I have
interrupt you
not.
real quick?
Please,
Um,
please, please jump in.
when you say your sample is only good for about 30 days, what do you mean as a sample?
The fingernails or toenails
Okay, so I think so it is a genetic sample of the individual who
that
is
you're applying the treatment to.
okay. So it
So
that is
you have a DNA frequency, which is, without being able to illustrate what that means, you have a DNA pattern. Think of it literally as a fingerprint.
right.
And this
Ev-
this little
uh,
diode applies it to your sample, and you sit nearby. Now, it means you don't have to be connected to the device, but they
oh,
do just, yeah, that's why it's spooky. That's why it's called
that's
remote.
that's
Yes,
that
yes.
dips into radionics. That's another interesting topic entirely.
Yes, yes, yes.
Ooh, I
So
like
that's
that.
another mode, and it's good and it's bad. Here's why it's bad. It's a third less effective. You have to run that program 3 times as long to get the purported effect. The good part is you don't have to be connected to the device at all. You just put it next to you at the desk and you work, and you can set a whole big cascade of things. There's something called the terrain protocol that they recommend you do to begin with. And that's right there. If you just pay attention to what's in the terrain protocol. If you go and get the software and download the little control panel and open it up and read the terrain protocol, you'll see that it progresses through pesticides, heavy metals. I mean, it goes through everything that we can encounter, including a very, very detailed catalog of the infectious burden. So that's they recommend that you begin with that, and they caution against the Herxheimer effect. That when we were talking about releasing mercury and having then bioavailable mercury released back out into your body, we you want to take certain steps. Like if you're doing mercury treatment, you want to have a whole lot of cilantro. You want a ton of you just do a cilantro smoothie. Just get like two big bunches of it and just put it in a juicer, a simple like the bullet mixer, and drink it like you can put yogurt in it, you can do whatever you want, but the point is that cilantro will chelate mercury. They will bind and help remove it from the body. That's why I was saying it's not a silver bullet. You don't just get this magic little box and then you can eat whatever you want and drink and smoke and carry on. You got to be sensible about everything you're doing. And this is the kind of therapy that I would say is probably very important to pair with sauna therapy, because heat therapy is very, very important about getting this stuff all the way out of the body, finishing the process of the the excretory path.
Awesome. Thank you for
Where would
that.
you like to go next? What have we not explored in this space?
Well, let's see here. We were going from. I was so interested in the how it tips into radionics a little bit there. And then you blew me away with the cilantro, which is very unfortunate for those of you out there who think it tastes like soap and have that particular genetic difference. Um,
Yeah, you can pair phytonutrients. You can have a two-pronged attack to help keep the stuff. It's about, think of it like getting a hot air balloon off the ground. Sorry, that was I didn't
it's
mean
no,
to
it's
do that.
very apropos.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
I agree. It's good. It's good.
not a quote unquote Chinese spy balloon, but you want it to get it far enough away to get over the border. You don't want it to just fall right back down into your own space. So you want to get the stuff up and away, and being intelligent about, first of all, starting with baselines. If you're going to be serious, if you're of a certain age, I don't know that you need to do testing for a young child unless you know that there really is a concern. There's expression of a behavioral change or a biological change that says there's been some kind of a toxic exposure beyond, I went running through the field and I had an allergic reaction to the long grass, something like that. Um, but I think that as an adult, it's a really important step to do your baselines. And so there are a couple different, general domains of testing for the more exotic substances that build up in the body. One of them is hair testing. And if you've ever done hair testing, you'll know that the instructions tell you precisely where on the body you should take the sample, because there are kind of old cells. There are hair follicles that are just sort of more of like waste channels, and then there are hair cells that are going to give fresh DNA. And you can read all kinds of metal toxicities and pesticide toxicities from a hair sample. And there's different places, different levels of, you can do alkalinity testing. But again, there are about, I think, three or four different key measures of alkalinity in different techniques. So getting all of those baselines when it comes back to how do I prepare for, maybe I want to look at Rife technology. I want to start adding and subtracting. I want to add good things in my diet like cilantro that help naturally pull metals out of my body, which are only going to do good things for my brain, because hello, Alzheimer and aluminum particulates. Come on, kids, we got to think about these things. You think
That's
you do it now before you're beginning to degrade with a condition. You get in there and you do the cotton gin, you clean out those little bits. So that's my approach to all of this. I think it's a wonderful tool among many. that intersect, as you mentioned earlier. You tend to the psychological and the emotional and the spiritual, and certainly the biological. But this is one of those tools that is a little more subtle. Now, there's one last area, and that's what you started out with when you were talking about the big emitters. There are two major, we'll think of this sort of as sort of two different levels of treatment with this Rife device we're talking about. The levels we've already talked about are level one. All those modalities are subtle. They're effective, but they're subtle. If you and this is where you would see maybe a testimony from somebody who has had a major turnaround in a serious condition like cancer. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can go out and find people who have had this device and had the benefit and a corrective action from using this intervention. And we're talking about there's a big ball that looks like the high school science teacher, like she blinded me with science. It looks like a plasma ball. And there's a plasma wand that looks like something off the set of Star Trek. And those are putting out a huge field, a measurable, very, very strong field. And I've watched several testimonies from people who were able to have a very beneficial effect from using that therapy. And then the last one is the scalar. Now, the scalar emitter is a set of it looks like men in black suitcases. They look like professional black, like you'd expect them to be packed with guns or scientific equipment. Um, and one is the emitter and one is the receiver. And as they point at each other, you just put them several feet apart. You could put them, say, on either end of the couch, pointing at one another. They'll make a massive field and will completely envelop the body. Also, the particle efficiency, the amplitude of this particular treatment is stronger than any of the others. And again, I've seen people having serious discussions about correcting cancer and other problems using a scalar treatment. I've never had a condition that serious. I haven't bought that part of the equipment. Again, it's approachable compared to what you spend on any other serious course of therapy. It's the kind of thing that financially you might find having one for the family could be quite an excellent predictive tool. And you hopefully won't ever know how beneficial it was for you because people just keep going on and their bodily systems work, their excretory pathways work. They are effective at fighting off or keeping at bay any sort of long-term infectious burden that we get. And it may be all thanks to these preventative tools that we put in, diet included, a Rife therapy included, sauna therapy included. These are the spaces that for me, I think are going to be where I continue to focus over time.
The scalar is becoming a very popular word these days.
Oh,
And
yes.
yeah, it's coming out all over the place. So, technology, once available, tends to become adapted in a multitude of different fields. No pun intended.
It's the
Just,
but bump. That was no, that was good. That was like a physics joke. That was Mr. Data. Mr. Data would have loved that joke.
mm,
Um, you did you know about experiments between Big Island and Maui and transmitted electricity?
I do not.
Tesla's
Although
dream of wireless electricity.
I know that there was a young guy. I want to say his name. He goes by like Dr. Carter or he's a young gentleman, and he created his own very redneck, to be frank, but
Mm-hmm.
functional transit transmitted station, and he's transmitting through the earth. And so all you need to do is build the proper receiver wound to the proper length of the wave. I think it was a quarter of the length of his wave, and you'd be able to receive the electricity that it was generating. So Dr. Parkenstein was what he goes by on YouTube, and the gentleman also has a pretty eclectic taste for like 1800s technology and paraphernalia. but please go on more because I have a feeling that Hawaii is probably a little bit more upscale.
He's a steampunk time traveler, it sounds like. Okay, so that's cool. I like that. Um, I have a couple of colleagues in Hawaii, and I'll tell you, I'm just gonna do it. It's Friday night. We've had a good conversation. I've enjoyed getting to know you. It looks like we're kind of coming up on rounding up towards the hour. So I'll tell you about what I have heard anecdotally from some residents on Maui. One, weird green lasers shooting off the top of Haleakala all the time. Weird green lasers. I would assume that that's going to be an advanced communication technology. I don't think they would be doing weapons, something like, a say a focused particle wave or any kind of a weaponized wave. But he said it's a big green laser and it shoots up into space. So I'm assuming it's like, is that a download station from a solar platform, and they're experimenting with the transmission of wireless electricity? I believe that comports with some of the models that I've seen illustrated, right? I don't have a security clearance. I'm not working in those compartments. So that was one of the things that they've reported. What I did see a good paper on was about the island to island transmission experiments. So again, this is Tesla's dream of just feeding electricity to the world in a wireless format and giving it away. And boy, that sure didn't work for Edison and everybody else, all of the other money grubbers back at the beginning of the former century. So but they reported that they had a good success in transmitting a consistent electric current, in maintaining a cohesion of the waveform. And I think the most interesting things that I read about, at least in the little that I explored it, was about, I think, atmospheric effects having some bias on the focus. They had problems with focus staying locked. Now they're locked, I mean, they are right there across the channel from each other. So it's actually a good laboratory. And Haleakala, if you've been to the top, it looks like the surface of the moon. Literally, they could have filmed the moon landing there. It's just this big, red, dusty, barren wasteland, and so different than there's these silver sword cactuses and different animals, and it's like a different place than down the tropical shoreline that you see of the rest of Maui. But anyhow, so that's what I heard. And I'm going to throw this in just for fun, just because it's been a good conversation. I have another colleague on Maui, and when I worked with him, he confided in me about a very interesting chapter of his Navy career. Now, I can tell you about this because the Department of Defense came out of the closet about this last May, when they had a long, we'll say, I think it was an intelligence committee briefing with the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they talked about UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, which is just the new name for UFO. And as it turns out, there has been a 70-year cover up and millions and millions and millions of dollars in reverse engineered technology. Now, as much as I'd love for you to go and run and watch all the X Files again and say, yes, it's all true. No, that was Chris Carter. I don't know. I can't tell you all of the realities, but I did see, when we're talking about hard science and weird science, things about T. Thompson Brown, using specialized electromagnetic bias. They said that the purpose of the experiment was to do some new methods of welding, and what they ended up doing was causing inadvertent phasing effects, including people and objects melting and phasing into other solid objects. Think of the Philadelphia experiment. So that's a real interesting. If you're into history and you like science fiction, turn off the Netflix and Amazon for a while and go back and dig into what really happened, in the last 70 years. So the reason I'm bringing all of this weird stuff about UAPs and UFOs and strange history is that this colleague of mine, who I cannot name because I told him I'd keep him anonymous,
His name's
is
Bob,
an
folks. It's
his
Bob.
name's Bob. So Bob's an
Yep.
older gentleman. clearly. He worked in the Navy in the 1960s and he worked in naval intelligence. Can you guess, Scott, what he told me that knocked my socks off that he used to do when he was an NIS officer?
I would say regular interactions and briefings with people who look like us but aren't necessarily from around here.
No. Excellent guess. He was one of the men in black
Oh
from a
shit.
naval intelligence perspective. He debriefed pilots out on their carriers right after they would have encounters and give them the threat and tell them about their national security order and imprisonment and fines and you'd never happened and don't talk about it to the rest of your crew and yada 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 yada. That was his job. He was one of those guys. And he told me about it in no uncertain terms. And to know this person, I can't tell you any more about him, but let's just say he is, from a business and professional and development perspective, he is in the upper 5% of the world. He is a very accomplished individual. He is perfectly deadly serious and he doesn't pull your leg. And I had this weird gut feeling about getting onto this topic with him somehow one day. I don't remember how it came up. And that came tumbling out about his career in the Navy. So there you go. There's the cherry on the sundae.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's fully in my wheelhouse. I spent a, a lot of time as a young person being on the outskirts because my parents brought me up in a not necessarily traditional way,
Mm-hmm.
in a not necessarily traditional area. But
Mm-hmm.
uh
What, Huntsville, Alabama?
well, Yelm, Washington, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, there's a school out there called Ramtha School of Enlightenment that my parents used to take me to when I was very young. And
Okay.
one could say it talks a lot about energy and anatomy and the philosophies that kind of parallel like the law of one kind of stuff, more or less. But everybody's got their own flavor, you know. And
Yeah, and that's about my depth of understanding of it. I mean, I think I remember some stuff from the 80s about press, but any time that the press had an opportunity to sort of not demonize, but clown someone who had a religious path that wasn't the mainstream Christianity, um, just like a mass murderer, they just would treat them, they it was as an expose, and it was always very lurid.
yes,
And as an adult, I look back at some of those events and I'm like, it would be really nice to hear what happened from an inside perspective. So I get it.
well,
I have a
you know,
little bit of insight.
you know what happened though was right. Like they made the circuses and freak shows illegal, and then they just gave that job to the media. So uh,
Well, and I'll tell you, we talk about history and the era of, say, like the post-war, the Cold War era. I mean, I don't know why they call it cold. It was hot. They were doing some scary, freaky stuff that is affecting us today. It still, makes a difference in our world. It's shaped our timeline.
oh yeah,
So I'm very, very, very heartened. I'm very, very appreciative of your time and spending some time with me. And I wish you the very best with continued conversations and interesting people.
I
And
I have to have you back, Nick. I have to have you
well,
back.
and I think that if there's a point where we could get our mutual friend, just get aligned and make sure it's the right timing and the right topic and all of that, I'm happy to have a broader conversation. As you can tell, I've got an Irish mouth, so
Oh,
it's like, oh
I
God.
I embrace profanity. I look at it as a badge of integrity and honor because you don't hear politicians curse and everybody knows they lie. So I'd rather curse and tell the truth,
Oh yeah, and with the
you
kinds
know?
of things that we're dealing with in our life, the kind of things that you and I are having to clean up from the previous generations. Yeah, I got some choice words.
Yes.
So,
Well,
all
we'll
right,
move forward. Please tell everybody where they can find you, where you're available.
absolutely. I don't maintain a hub, because I am an anonymous researcher. One of the reasons for that is that a couple of the domains that I look at and talk with in other circles about have brought about what I think are wet works or assassinations of scientists or eyewitnesses. So I've made a commitment that in social media I don't identify who I am, but I'm accessible. So I'm on Twitter, and my handle is at pizza pickles purr, 1 R, like a cat purr. And I have a space cat for an avatar, and there's a flying cat that says pouncing on injustice and biting it. So pretty easy to spot. I'm a good mixture of cat memes and wildlife stuff. I try to stay off of the political topics. I'm exhausted with throwing mud at a left candidate or a right candidate. I am topical. I'm dealing with topics and issues. I love all of people that I'm connected with, regardless of who they want to vote for, where they want to go to church, things like that. So I will try to be a good. If you want to follow, great. If you want to just look at my timeline, you'll see that I post a number of scientific historical items and cutting edge items because I'm connected with a pretty large circle of folks around the world. And so I share bits and pieces about health, wellness, therapies, disease, getting past the disease. That's really the point of it, not to fascinate on it. And science technology. I'm a fan of all of these amazing microscopies and where electron microscopy is moving towards. I think it's just incredible about what we're able to see processes happen in 3D, in 4D over time. And I'm just thrilled about that kind of stuff. So that's my content, and a bunch of raccoons and cats. So that's me.
He also, I've noticed that Sundays you do some health stuff too. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I have made it a habit, and thank you for bringing that up, of joining Apothecarol, and you can find her on Twitter at Apothecarol, like apothecarium, but her name is Carol with a C, so it's Apothecarol, and she holds a space every Sunday morning, and I've just made it a habit to jump in. There's just a great mix of people. There's a mix of frontline practitioners, and then it's balanced out by more, say, there's a pharmacology scientist in there, there's a neuroscientist who comes in, there's emergency doctors, there's a lot of nurses. So it's a space where there's been a whole lot of truth for a while, since I know there's just sort of recently been the floodgates. They've allowed us to criticize what's been happening for 3 years. But Carol's space has been fantastic for that. So she brings people in and has a topical focus each week. She is both a caregiver, and she coaches people to stay ahead of health problems. That's what she calls a client, is someone who she helps you with your whole plan. So I just love her, and I hang out with Carol on Sundays. And then on occasion, based on how many fish are biting, how many people want to join, I hold a private Zoom similar to this. And I talk about biowarfare history starting in the 1950s, and it covers several of the things we touched on tonight, including cancer and HIV.
Awesome stuff, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I look forward to having some more conversations in the future with you on this stuff, either here or somewhere else, because it's, I always appreciate people with a different set of knowledge and skills than I do. And when they let me pick their brain, it's a total bonus. So thank you.
Well, next time I'll let you get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, it's gold. It's gold all the way around.
Awesome.
Thank
Well,
thank you,
cheers.
both of you. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everybody watching or listening, for giving us your time. I hope you learned something and expanded your mental horizons. Have a great day.